Constitution is important in American political life because it lays out the foundation for the rules and the laws that govern American politics. It also helps to structure our political institutions. By creating a three-branch system of government in Articles 1, Articles 2, and Article 3 of the Constitution, we create the basic building blocks for American political institutions and establish a balance of power between the national and state governments as well as between the three branches of government. Many of the issues that are related to the Constitution are actually related to what the Constitution doesn't say. The American Constitution is actually one of the shortest constitutions if we look and compare globally as well as between the American states. It's very brief in what it says and leaves a lot unsaid. So what that means is that interpretations of the U.S. Constitution become very significant, as well as questions of whether we should add to the U.S. Constitution. We don't often add to the U.S. Constitution. In fact, it's been amended since the Bill of Rights was passed in 1789 only 17 times. But recently we've heard calls, for example, regarding a constitutional amendment related to gay marriage and whether we should officially amend the U.S. Constitution to define marriage between a man or a woman or to lay out other ground rules regarding the marriage issue. So the Constitution really is the basic premise of our government, and it will always be our ultimate reference point. So if, for example, we ask the question of, does the government have the power to subsidize student loans? We ultimately have to ask, is there some place in the Constitution where we can find a justification for the government getting involved in that issue area? If we want to ask, does the government have the power to promote the availability of health care for every citizen? We have to look back to the Constitution and say, can we find that in the Constitution? Can we find the power or the authority for the national government to do that? Is that something the state government should do? Is that something that is a natural right of a human being that no constitution should ever allow to be taken away? And what we've seen in a lot of recent debates, for example, involving civil liberties, the fundamental rights to life, liberty, happiness, and the natural rights that the framers thought were essential to citizens should never be allowed to be taken away. And we see that in the Constitution, things like free speech, things like the right to be secure in your person, your houses, your things, really should be never taken away, and that almost draws a line in the sand. So the Constitution is both a permission slip and a limiting document. Right? It both grants permission and takes away permission from the government on what the government can and cannot do. The
reason why they wrote probably is because of just to get some kind of basic principles for, foundation of a living, I guess you could say.
Well, so the founding fathers wanted, I guess, as the country moved forward and grew, they wanted their successors to hold to the same principles.
After the Revolutionary War, the founders set up a weak confederate of states. This national government was so weak that it could not provide for basic needs, such as common defense and interstate trade. In 1787, delegates came together to write a constitution that would establish a stronger central government, but would also protect individual liberties. They did this by creating a more powerful national government with three branches, and later by adding the Bill of Rights to the Constitution.
Judiciary, executive, and legislative. Right, they all check and balance each other. President or executive can veto. It makes sure that people don't abuse their power.
Well, prevents one branch from getting too powerful.
The Constitution creates a national government with judicial, legislative, and executive branches. In Articles 1 through 3, it lays out the powers of each branch. The legislative branch, or Congress, has the power to make laws. The president and the executive branch implement laws. The judicial branch, or the courts, interprets the laws. These articles also specify what powers each branch has over the other two. This is called checks and balances. For example, Congress has the power to pass bills, but the president can veto them. When the president nominates a federal judge, the Senate can reject the candidate.
Obviously, it's a set of points that are supposed to guarantee a right to do this or a right to do that.
The first Congress feared that a strong national government would endanger the liberty of the people. Therefore, they passed 10 amendments to the Constitution guaranteeing specific rights. This is It includes freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion, the right to bear arms, and the rights of criminal defendants. The Ninth and 10th Amendments also reserve rights not specifically mentioned to the states or the people.
I think the framers would have had to have been naive to create any type of document that they thought would not change with the movement of time.
Well, they're amendments, but I mean, as we've seen many times before, sometimes it changes because of the interpretation of the Constitution, which is up to the Supreme Court.
The framers expected the Constitution to change to meet the needs of the people. There are two primary ways we change our Constitution. First, the Supreme Court can reinterpret the Constitution when it rules on cases. Americans can also pass amendments, although this isn't easy to do. It's a two-stage process. The country has to propose and ratify the amendment. To propose an amendment, 2/3 of Congress must support it, or 2/3 of state legislatures must call for a national convention. To ratify, 3/4 of state legislatures or state conventions must support it. It's very complicated, and that's one reason we've passed relatively few.
It's remarkable that the Constitution has, just quite short really, has really effectively governed this country for over 200 years, and it's a rarity if you look across the world in that regard. What we now know as the Constitution is not necessarily the way that it was ultimately presented and debated at the Constitutional Convention. And there were huge debates at the convention about what the government should look like, what the powers of the various branches should be, etc., qualifications. There were some very important debates over things like slavery and representation that threatened to dismantle the entire enterprise. The compromise made in terms of representation between the small states and the big states by creating a bicameral legislature in which the House of Representatives has representation based on the population, but the Senate has equal representation for all of the states, was one of the main compromises that was struck at the convention in order to get consensus around the structures that would be included in it. And those types of compromises became very important, not only for settling on a document that was acceptable to all, but then ultimately in the public effort to ratify the Constitution and enable it to go into effect. Incidentally, we continue to see government making compromises at the federal level and even across all levels of government. And I think that the notion and the idea of compromise was a precedent set at the Constitutional Convention and has remained with us, an important part of politics and debates about public policy in this country for over 200 years. Well, it's clearly set forth in the preamble that we are an evolving nation. Now, the Founding Fathers, they're writing the Constitution at the Convention, were part of the elite, but they understood that this was a document to govern a country mainly of common people. And so they wrote a document that had elements that were relevant and important to the common people that would make up the majority of this country. And I think that one of the other important aspects of the preamble that's useful to keep in mind is the fact that the Founding Fathers knew that they were not necessarily creating a perfect union. They were creating a more perfect union. And the whole notion of a perfect arrangement of government institutions was something that was probably considered impossible. But there was no reason not to try to create the best system possible. And this is a system that survived for over 200 years. And we continue to this day to make improvements to try to constantly create a more and more perfect union. And it's possible we'll never have the perfect union, but as long as we strive to continue to create a more perfect union, we will be acting in the spirit of the Founding Fathers. Scholars look at a range of issues when thinking about the Constitution in modern times. One of the things that they look for is how the institutions set forth in the Constitution operate and how they function internally and with respect to each other as part of a larger governing system. There are scholars who are looking at issues of constitutional matters, constitutional law scholars, looking at legal and historical aspects of the Constitution, but then you have a whole host of scholars who look empirically at aspects of the arrangements of government and the institutions to try to assess how the various institutions of government operate and how they relate to each other. And so you see both empirical and qualitative work that examines how the system of shared powers works, how the checks and balances work, and some of the other constraints and limitations that are created by the Constitution that allow for things like strategic behavior on the part of the branches. So I'll give you one example. The president knows that he or she can veto legislation, but he or she also knows that the Congress can override vetoes. And so when something goes to the president for approval, presidents can veto that bill, or they can approve that bill, sign it into effect. But they may need to be strategic in how they go about this, because they can anticipate what Congress will do in terms of whether or not they want to override a veto. And so a president, in order to preserve political capital, for example, may decide not to veto a bill that he or she could be against, because he or she may know that that veto will be overridden. And so this type of strategic behavior is very interesting to scholars, and the kinds of scenarios that allow for that type of behavior is constantly examined and increasingly examined by scholars looking at how the structures of the Constitution operate with respect to each other. One of the other things that scholars examine that is also fairly rare as you look across the landscape of countries across the world is the federal nature of our Constitution, this division of power between the federal government and the state governments. This was always an important issue for the Founding Fathers, and it creeps up here and there in politics and debates about public policy. Even if you look at the healthcare debate right now, the appropriate role for the federal government vis-a-vis what the state should be doing across the board is something that scholars are also interested in. And this interaction between the states and the federal government, which also evolves, I think, is something that is a curiosity for many scholars.
The U.S. Constitution establishes checks and balances among the three branches of government to make sure no one branch would become too powerful. The U.S. Attorney General is the head of the Department of Justice and a high-ranking member of the executive branch, appointed by the President. In 2009, the Attorney General had federal agents walk over weapons into Mexico to distribute them to drug cartels to gain insider information on the cartels. The mission was a complete failure, and guns wound up in the hands of drug dealers. When the U.S. House of Representatives ordered an investigation into the operation, President Obama used his executive privilege to end the investigation. Should Congress be allowed to investigate high-ranking members of the executive branch, like the Attorney General?
Absolutely. If they did something wrong, if something's in question, absolutely. Nobody should be immune to investigation, even the president. To find out what went wrong, why did it go wrong, whose responsibility was it. That's exactly what it is, accountability.
You're not having just one person's opinion on, how things are run. So when you have multiple people involved, you have multiple opinions, you have multiple backgrounds and multiple ideas. Therefore, it gives you more opportunity to see, what's right and wrong in different people's opinions, and not just have it be one person's opinion.
That's why we have 3 separate branches.
The power to investigate makes sure that each branch can be held accountable. Investigations can also shed light on bad practices, and in doing so, lead the way to better government. But are there circumstances in which Congress shouldn't investigate? Let's listen to some people who think there are.
Sometimes that investigation might make public some things which, necessarily might be time sensitive and should be private. For now, maybe like agents' lives or something like that, certain strategies they want to keep secret for now because they're in place. So, they should be able to investigate the higher levels of government, but I guess for certain things, they should wait.
I think the president should have the power to stop an investigation if it has to do with national security. We seem to be so partisan that it doesn't matter. If I'm a Democrat, then I don't care what the Democrats do. If I'm a Republican, I don't care what the Republicans do. But if I'm a Republican, then I'm going to investigate the Democrats for anything. That's the shame, is that we've become so partisan that hardly any of us can trust anything that any of them say.
As you just heard, many people believe that investigations can compromise national security or reveal information that can endanger people's lives. Investigations can also become a tool for fighting between political parties or partisan bickering. As a result, some argue that investigations undermine the legitimacy of the democratic process. Political scientists have found that when the political institutions are divided, that is, different parties control the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, there's a greater partisan conflict and more investigations. Partisan investigations may keep the government from focusing on true policy problems. Every president since Washington has claimed executive privilege. The gun walking operation marked the first time President Obama used this privilege. But President George W. Bush also invoked it 6 times, and Bill Clinton 14 times. The question is, when is the use of executive privilege justified for national security reasons, and when is it an abuse of authority? How can we stop Congress from using investigations to launch partisan attacks, but still make sure that it can hold the executive branch accountable? How can we make sure that our system of checks and balances supports our democratic system?
The Constitution can often seem like sort of this antiquated old document. We picture it as it is encased in the National Archives on this old weathered paper written in quill ink by men that none of us will ever know and have ever known. But the bottom line is that even though the Constitution is an old document, we might call it a classic, right? It's an oldie but goodie. It's something that continues to endure and continues to affect our everyday life. As students, for example, the Constitution establishes the boundaries for the relationships between the national and state government on the issue of education. The Constitution establishes the boundaries of what your free speech rights are, of what your privacy rights are. Even though privacy is not explicitly stated in the Constitution, judicial interpretation of that document has allowed the Supreme Court to carve out a right to privacy. The Constitution is also relevant to students because it sets up the Congress, which makes the laws under which we live. It creates the office of the Chief Executive, who serves as the ambassador for the United States around the world. It creates a Supreme Court that is able to interpret that document and give it life and allow it to evolve over the course of time. And without sort of this genius document that the framers crafted in such a short time, one Philadelphia summer, we would never have the system of government that we have today. The Articles of Confederation were, in many respects, a failure as a document because they didn't take into account the challenges of governing such a large and diverse nation. The Constitution, on the other hand, accepts the challenge of governing a large and diverse nation, and as James Madison argues in the Federalist Papers, actually crafts a system that is built to govern a large and diverse nation. It crafts a system of checks and balances and of separation of powers, and ultimately those checks and balances are what creates a system of government where no one majority is allowed to run wild. Where in the United States, unlike many other countries, historically we valued minority power, right? We say that we live in a system of majority rule but minority rights. And that allows for the expression of a variety of diverse viewpoints, and that allows for many people to have their say and have their influence in the American political system. The Constitution creates a framework in which a variety of diverse individuals can have their say. So whether it's the young versus the old, whether it's rich versus poor, whether it's white versus black, right? The Constitution creates a system to allow for input from multiple